In this exciting episode of the Perry Pod, we meet a deadbeat husband who's helping a woman escape her, well, deadbeat husband. I've got a funny feeling these deadbeat husbands are headed on a collision course. It's Season 2, Episode 13 of Perry Mason, The Case of the Borrowed Brunette. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple: provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. I plan to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and as time permits, I'll look at some of those made-for-TV movies too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. Each episode I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and if the episode was based on a novel, I'll compare the book with its television adaptation. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia, as well as tackle the episode's main theme. We'll feature a Perry proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and then we'll finish with a post-case water cooler, where just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of their adventures. But first, to the law library! Each episode in the law library, we return to prior cases to refresh our memories about Perry's past so we can find fresh precedents for future cases. Our legal quandary for this episode concerns finding a good, reliable private detective to give testimony. This is particularly difficult in the case of the borrowed brunette, since the murder victim is himself a private detective and one of questionable character. On the stand, we meet Mr. Folsom, an employee of the Interstate Detective Agency.
There were 3 garbage cans there. She lifted the lid of the middle one, apparently dropped something into it, and then replaced the lid.
It turns out he's a reliable enough guy, and Perry doesn't call out his corruption so much as his all-too-human expansion of his initial experience.
And isn't it a fact that you did not report that she dropped something into it?
Well, no, if you want to get technical about it. But in thinking it over,
We don't want your second thoughts, Mr. Folsom. The initial impression is all we want. Thank you, that'll be all.
Now, of course, we've got a model in this show for what a good detective looks like. Paul Drake is scrupulous, and we've seen in Season 2, he's become a more informed source of insight for Perry. But he's only appeared on the stand once thus far. What other private detectives have offered testimony? The pickings are slim and rotten to the core. We got Jason Beckmeyer, old murdering Beckmeyer himself, from the case of the runaway corpse.
Mr. Beckmeyer, you are a licensed private investigator?
That's right.
You were employed in that capacity by the late Edward Davenport?
I was.
Did he ever ask you to locate a doctor for him who was not a member of the American Medical Association?
He did. He wanted me to find a quack who had an office near a motor court.
Fans will note that the runaway corpse was played by John Stevenson, who's the husband in the case of the borrowed brunette. Our other conspicuously crooked private detective who offers testimony, Arthur West, in the case of the green-eyed sister.
Mr. West, you were acquainted with the late J.J. Stanley?
Yes,
As a matter of fact, you found his body.
I did.
You're a private detective, Mr. West?
Yes,
Licensed, of course, by the police commission?
yes.
And you met the late J.J. Stanley in your professional capacity as a private investigator?
This episode's victim, Melvin Slater, seems like a schizophrenic operator. He's a good private detective who seems to abide by the law, but he's not a good person. Note his treatment of his wife. So, here's hats off to you, Mr. Folsom of the Interstate Detective Agency. We hope we see more like you in upcoming episodes. Now, without further ado, let's get to the plot of this episode. The case of the borrowed brunette. Miss Eva Martell is attending a very strange casting call as the episode opens, and her potential employer doesn't mince words. He wants details.
What are your measurements, Miss Martell? You know, your measurements.
34, 24, 34.
Your age?
27.
Single?
Yes.
It seems Melvin Slater wants someone who looks like his client, Helen Reynolds. It will be Miss Martell's job to impersonate Miss Reynolds so as to throw some private detectives off the scent of the real Helen Reynolds. Sure, Eva Martell gets to keep her Aunt Aggie with her, but that doesn't mean she feels more secure about the whole thing.
Mr. Slater acts awfully strange for a private detective.
Don't borrow trouble, child.
Even when we took some personal things from our own apartment, he made us put them in a shopping bag to make it look as though we were just bringing groceries in here.
Eventually, Melvin Slater's private life starts messing with his business life. His wife shows up at Helen Reynolds' apartment asking for cash because Melvin hasn't given her any. That's right, private detective, the one who's so fair he hasn't even touched Miss Martell, there hasn't been a hint of impropriety, is a deadbeat husband and dad. Aunt Aggie and Eva make their way to Perry's office pronto. His advice is crystal clear.
Very simply, Miss Nolte, my advice is to quit. To pack up and go home. You're vulnerable.
Oh?
Melvin Slater and Helen Reynolds don't want to just give up the impersonation so easily, though. Helen Reynolds actually shows up in Perry's office so Perry can get her to sign, well, a pretty ridiculous contract that will keep his clients free of any criminal liability, even if they proceeded to take every last cent Helen has. She's incensed.
Why, I'll be giving them a license to steal me blind.
Not quite.
Well, that's the way it looks to me. I'd be signing my life away. You lawyers make me sick.
But it's Eva and Aunt Aggie who should really be upset, because as soon as Perry gets them back to work, they proceed to find Melvin Slater's corpse inside Helen Reynolds' apartment. The murder weapon? Oh, it was Aunt Aggie's, and Eva can't account for all of Aunt Aggie's actions. Plus, it turns out that Aunt Aggie kinda has a problem with the truth.
Mr. Mason, about Aunt Agnes, you have to take some of the things she says with a... Well, it isn't that she means to deceive you. It's just that...
Just that she's a liar.
Well, yes. Yes, I guess she is.
Perry goes to bat for Eva when he visits the district attorney's office, but Hamilton Berger relishes the chance to shoot Perry down.
Let me tell you something, Perry. At approximately 1 o'clock, Melvin Slater was killed by a bullet from Agnes Nolte's gun. Your Eva Martell has sworn in her affidavit that she was with Agnes Nolte every minute of that time.
I just told you she may have...
Therefore, if she gets on the stand and testifies that she was with Agnes Nolte, she's going to be convicted, along with Agnes Nolte, of murder in the first degree. But if she tries to change her testimony, she's going to be convicted of perjury. No deal, Perry. You just struck out.
In the courtroom, we get Lieutenant Tragg identifying the murder weapon in a way only he knows how.
I show you now this gun and ask if you can identify it.
Oh, yes, I can. It has my mark on it.
His mark! Shout out to listener Chris Snyder for cluing us in to this Tragg technique and telling us to look for it. What a morbid legacy indeed Tragg leaves. A string of murder weapons, each of which bears his mark. Keep your eyes and ears peeled for more of them. Back to the case. Who are our suspects? If it's not Aunt Agnes and Eva Martell who did it. Well, there's Helen Reynolds, but she was too busy getting together with her lover boy.
Where did you go when you left my office on the day of the murder?
To my lover, who is not a lover, Mr. Mason. To the man I'm in love with, a gentleman, a man full of warmth and sweetness and an abundance of love.
That lover boy was definitely not her husband, who's the other major suspect. And once Perry floats what we should call the trash can theory, Grant Reynolds has to confess.
How long to pull that trigger, Mr. Reynolds? Not long enough to give Slater the chance to tell you he wasn't the man you were looking for, was it?
What makes you think he wasn't? He had a key to my wife's apartment. He sat around the place as if he owned it. Sure. Maybe he started by working for her. But I know my wife.
I gotta say, what a scumbag. In the denouement of the episode, Aunt Aggie shows that despite her problem with the truth, she certainly has a generous spirit. She wanted that cash not to pay off her legal bills. Don't know how she's going to pull that one off. She wanted it to give to Mrs. Slater, which is really nice, I think. I wonder if Perry feels as generous with Paul, though. This is the second consecutive case where Perry's probably not going to get a paycheck from his clients. Remember Sarah Warner from the case of the Shattered Dream. And Paul, he came up short in his quest to find Helen's boy toy. Is this guy going to get paid?
Helen Reynolds' boyfriend. Where is he?
Oh, we stopped looking for him, Perry.
You stopped looking for him. Why?
Well, the judge had already dismissed the case. You'd already uncovered the murderer. Besides, we couldn't find him.
I'll speculate here that maybe the problem was that Paul was too busy trying to get a date with Miss Martell. Note this comment from earlier in the episode.
I do hope they come by. That Miss Martell is a doll.
That'll make your day complete.
I was thinking of my evening.
Now, this episode was a pretty faithful adaptation of the 1946 Earl Stanley Gardner novel. Let's talk about 4 of the differences. Number 1, Perry encounters the look-alike Brunette in a different way. As the novel opens, he and Della are driving along the street. They notice that all of these women who look the same are lined up on successive street corners. He takes an interest in the case through a brunette who does not get the job, and only through that person does he meet Miss Martell. Number 2, we actually meet Helen's boyfriend. He works in a bank. He's a loser. He's boring. Perry speculates that she's turned to this underling as a response to her bad relationship with her husband, who, by the way, is not named Grant. His name is Orville. Number 3, we not only meet Helen and her boyfriend, we also meet her husband Orville's girlfriend. That's right. He's jealous and he's a two-timer. I guess those two things aren't mutually exclusive, but it just shows the hypocrisy. And yes, he still is the murderer. And then finally, number 4, Perry does make a pitch to the DA about Miss Martell, but it's not Hamilton Berger. It's some guy named Harry Gulling who is vindictive against Perry and, of course, gets his clock cleaned in court, which is great. What's interesting is that in the book, it's clear that Perry only takes the case because he's going to be criminally liable for getting Eva Martell away from the cops if he can't manage to spring both the defendant the elderly woman who's not really Miss Martell's aunt, just a woman who was her nurse and helped raise her, and Miss Martell. So Perry doesn't really take on the case because he thinks it's a good one. He takes on the case because he thinks if he doesn't, he's going to get thrown in jail. I enjoyed the novel a lot, and I enjoyed the episode too. It was a good match. Now, let's get trivial, shall we? Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. A Della is something about a particular actor or actress in the episode. And a Perry is something we learn about our intrepid hero. Our Paul. This episode involves impersonation. We hear that the distinction between impersonation and deception involves impersonation's intent to defraud.
I take it you're aware it may be a crime to impersonate others.
Only where there is intent to defraud, Mr. Mason. I've gone into the matter thoroughly. There's no intent to defraud here.
So here's the Paul prompt for this episode. What kind of criminal charge would impersonation meant to defraud incur? Is something like identity theft the 2020 equivalent of this crime? Is there greater weight placed on physical as opposed to digital impersonation when it comes to the law? Our Della this week concerns Paula Raymond, Miss Helen Reynolds herself.
Mr. Mason, I believe you're right. I may be taking unfair advantage of them. Where do I sign?
You're a philosophical loser.
Raymond was born in 1924 as Paula Ramona Wright. Her father was a lawyer who moved from San Francisco to Hollywood after his divorce. And Paula studied theater in college, and her first break in Hollywood came as a photographer's model. She started acting in Hollywood pictures in the late 30s, appearing opposite Cary Grant and Dick Powell. In the 1940s, she starred in a series of film noirs and horror pictures, including the 1952 The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. In the 1950s and 60s, her IMDb shows her working more and more on television. Perry Mason, Maverick, 77 Sunset Strip, Peter Gunn. She was on them all. She was also up for the role of Kitty Russell in Gunsmoke, but turned it down, much to Amanda Blake's delight. Note, Amanda Blake had a beauty mark. Paula Raymond later speculated this was because she had a beauty mark. The producers liked it so much, when she turned down the role, they gave an artificial one to Amanda Blake. In 1962, Raymond was involved in a serious car accident. She was the passenger in a car that crashed into a tree, and the rear view mirror basically took off her nose. She was only able to return to acting after significant reconstructive surgery. This wasn't the only time her body broke down in ways that hurt her career. 1977, she's working on the soap opera Days of Our Lives. After 3 appearances, she accidentally trips on a telephone cord and breaks her ankle, and was subsequently written out of the show. I think she's excellent in this episode. The producers must have thought so too. They asked her back 4 more times. Paula Ramona Wright, aka Paula Raymond, died in 2003. Speaking of Helen Reynolds, our Perry this episode involves Miss Reynolds' assessment of our intrepid hero.
There's something about you, though in a subtler way, that reminds me of Grant. There's the same initial impact of a strong personality, the same steady, insistent pressure to overcome obstacles that I find attractive. It's a good deal softer in you, and wiser and more humanitarian. But it's there.
Now, since Grant Reynolds turns out to be the murderer, this is a backhanded compliment at best, right? It's intriguing to think that Perry is in many ways like the people he's trying to put behind bars, except that his talents and inclinations are all oriented toward justice and pursuing the good. As far as it goes, this is a way more accurate assessment of Perry than the one that was offered by Mrs. Banyan in the case of the jilted jockey. The theme for this episode is good men. Now, Perry is the finest man we know, no doubt. Yet in this episode, Helen Reynolds basically says he's a twin of her husband, who's the eventual murderer. Let's look at her husband and his mirror image, which is not Perry, contrary to Helen Reynolds' claims. It's actually our murder victim, Melvin Slater. Grant Reynolds, the possessive husband, is willing to suspect his wife at the drop of a hat. This is jealousy masking itself as love. He cares too much. He's a control freak. He wants power. Contrast him with the man he murders, Melvin Slater. He likes feeling out of control. He likes to gamble. He plays cards for high stakes, 1,800 clams in a friendly poker game, and skating on the thin ice that separates deception from impersonation. And then he's also the opposite of Grant. Grant cares too much about Helen's whereabouts. Melvin Slater couldn't care less. Hands his wife $20 instead of the $1,800 he's got in his wallet. That's why it's hilarious to me that we get a description from Helen Reynolds of what seems like a perfect man. Isn't it fitting that this show, which gives us romantic schnook after romantic schnook, see for instance, Grant Reynolds, Melvin Slater, can't actually produce the dream man? In the world of this show, such men, ones who are both honorable, like Perry, and a potential mate, unlike Perry, simply don't exist. No wonder Paul can't find him. Now, it's time for a Perry proverb. It is the wise man who is prudent enough to know the things he cannot change. Perry offers this response to jealous murderer Grant Reynolds.
You knew something was going on every time she even nodded to another man.
You'll never convince me there wasn't.
I wouldn't try, Mr. Reynolds.
Don't cast your pearls before swine, Perry says. Jealous husbands gonna be jealous. If they're gonna murder, all you can do is put them behind bars. Good luck trying to change their minds. Now, let's grab a swig from the water cooler.
There is one thing I don't understand.
Go on, Paul.
Our research prompt from the last episode involved perfume. You'll remember that Sarah Warner was sporting some really expensive eau de parfum.
Did you notice the perfume she was wearing?
Mm-hmm.
Eternity. $150 a half ounce.
You know, maybe she could hawk the stuff to pay her legal bills. We asked this: did this perfume exist? Myra Carraway did some detective work for us, unearthing the origins of the real Calvin Klein fragrance, Obsession. Came out in the 1980s. As for 1950s perfumes, I just want to list the names of some of the most popular fragrances. Femme de Rochas. Rochas was just like a famous French perfumery. It doesn't stand for roaches. It doesn't. Ooh, that sounds really great. Smells just like fresh roach. Arpège. Hypnotique and primitif, spelled with an F. Gotta love it. And my favorite, Soir de Paris. Night of Paris. As for expenses, well, Myra Carraway also tracked down a list of really expensive perfumes, thousands of dollars per bottle, with the top fragrance on the list going for $1 million. This was mostly, admittedly, as a result of its bottle, encrusted with jewels. Thanks for the Drake-level PI work, Aunt Mai. As always, I'd love feedback about this particular episode of the podcast in general. Was there something about this episode you'd like to comment on? Something you'd like to correct? You can email me at theperrypod@gmail.com, and you'll find that link in the show notes. All PerryPod episodes are available via Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes. Thanks again for joining me on this pod journey. Join us next time as Perry uncovers the fact that all that glitters is not gold. Fish. It's the case of the glittering goldfish. Join me, won't you? Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat.